Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Quantifiers. Today's reading comprehension is a blend of politics. It has got an element of futurism. It is talking a little bit about technology. Let us get down to understanding what the passage is all about.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quantifiers. Today's passage that we're going to be reading is an intersection of art history, along with some elements of political history, ideology, and of course, a criticism that is related to the same. We are talking about a couple of major movements which are becoming the focus of the passage, as well as the other focus on the passage is going to be related to the artistic movements. So basically, we are talking about these two things. Let us get down to reading the passage to understanding more details. The Futurism art movement was a 20th century product of the need to break off from the traditional styles and the insatiable desire for modernity. Futurism was a celebration of technology, power, and modern life, and an attempt to demonstrate the beauty of machine speed, violence, and change. So, the first word that we need to understand here is the word insatiable. Satiable as a word root or satiable as a word means to satisfy. Insatiable is something that is probably something that is not satisfied, right? So, there was a greed for reading more about something. Futurism was a celebration of technology, power, and modern life and had an attempt to demonstrate the beauty of machine speed, violence, and change. Aside from the artistic perspectives, Futurism also carried a strain of politics embedded within the movement. In fact, it was art forms of the 20th century. The machine ultimately led to the celebration of the arrival of the First World War and the over empowered, look at the word again, enthusiasm for modernity, and was one of the most politicized fascism. A direct relationship never lasts long. So basically, here in the first paragraph, we are glorifying the aspects of technology. We are glorifying the fact as to how the arrival of the machine was ultimately welcomed after the First World War, and vice versa. The front page of the French newspaper Le Figaro published the Futurist Manifesto in 1909 by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. With its launch, Futurism came to life. The embodiment of Futurism was critically related to the larger social and political crisis in Italy. Now, why are we making a mention of Italy? Because we are talking about fascism. It was a movement that was started in Europe, where the authoritarian regime, the dictators, or the people who were ruling the country, they believed that whatever is beneficial for the country, even if it is coming at the cost of compromising the interest of the general public, they are going to do that, right? So basically, when you talk about futurism, it was something that was critically related to the larger and social political crisis in Italy. Both before during the war, both before and during the war, futurism played a significant role in dissemination. Dissemination is the spread. In dissemination and support of the central values and ideology from which the pro fascist sentiments were constructed. So we know that futurism was also responsible for the proto fascist sentiments. The brilliant agitational propaganda. Now, can agitation be ever brilliant? But we are using it as an oxymoron to beautify the language. So, the brilliant agitational propaganda and the crowd stirring spectacle of futurism, artists were almost a model for the fascist. Mussolini, the Italian dictator, adopted many ideas and influences of Marinetti's innovations in his performances and public speeches. Nationalism, militarism, irrational violence, and general aestheticization. So, aesthetics is basically the appreciation of beauty. So, here we are talking about how violence was something that was being beautified, appeared in both futurist and fascist propaganda. The literary genre and narrative form of manifesto has been used by artists, before by the artists, but the members of futurism movements. So basically, when you talk about literature as a form, as a narrative form, as a manifesto as to what the government would do, or probably the dictators would do, it was something that was long being used by the artists. But the futurist movements, which were completely dependent on technology, refused to do so. The founder, Marinetti, was a political figure from the start. Before the end of before the end of used it as a political weapon, thus establishing its precedence among the subsequentarium, the war, Marinetti founded the Futurist political party, putting the entire movement at the forefront of the support of Mussolini and the idea of unified Italy. So basically, in these last 4 or 5 lines, we are talking about the fact as to how futurism as a concept was something that was being used by Marinetti to support Mussolini, and they wanted to unify Italy because of technology, right? So, somewhere we are talking about how technology had become a part of celebration, a part of power, and a part of modern life, something that is already being stated in the beginning of the passage. The direct links between futurism and fascism remain a huge embarrassment for Italians. Viewed by some as the source of national pride, futurism represented a brief moment when once again Italy was at the forefront of art and culture globally. Critics and historians often use this connection with fascism to depreciate modernism in general. So basically, last 3 or 4 lines are talking about what? Last paragraph, 3 or 4 lines are talking about what? That when you talk about a link between futurism and fascism, it was something that was not a very happy end for the Italians, right? Some of them had a very positive aspect related to futurism and fascism, but some of them believed that futurism represented just a momentary kind of a feeling, right? And once again, it was the art and culture that was basically displaying Italy as a hub of culture globally. Critics and historians often use this connection with fascism to depreciate modernism in general. The obvious influence of Cubism, which is again a form of art, is also another variation of the criticism, claiming that the entire movement was nothing more than a crude provincial version of other forms. So basically, now in the last paragraph, we can see how the critics and the historians are basically criticizing the whole concept of fascism and the whole concept of futurism. They are the ones who primarily support art as a form. Ultimately, futurism was a major force in art world and a bona fide social movement. Bona fide is something that's authentic. Its followers called for anarchy. Anarchy is a state of lawlessness. जहां आप ये बोलते हो कि भाई पूरी सरकार को हटा दिया जाए and the power should be in the hands of the common man, but found themselves often aligned with Mussolini's fascists. So आप ये देखो कि जो इन्होंने हमारे को पॉइंट बताया है अबाउट फ्यूचरिज्म, देयर वर टू एंड्स ऑफ फ्यूचरिज्म. एक एंड जो बोलता है कि हमें लॉ को फॉलो नहीं करना है, देयर शुड बी टोटल एनार्की. दूसरा एंड या तो फिर हम मसलिनी के फासिज्म को फॉलो करेंगे. As the movement's founder, Marinetti gathered zealous, that is, excited adherents or followers. The whole ideology was very similar to the propaganda of the far right-wing parties, which would prove to be fatal for the arts movement in the future. So even though there were a lot of people who supported this whole act of futurism, which was being published by Marinetti, and it gained momentum post that, but it was again something that would eventually prove to be very fatal for the arts movement in the future. Nevertheless, futurism artworks were incredibly impactful up until Marinetti's death in 1944. So we can clearly understand that from 1909 onwards, when it was first conceptualized till 1944, that was until the death of Marinetti, this whole movement was something that was highly successful. Futurism has been regarded as extinct ever since the death of its leader, Marinetti. So probably we can understand that after 1944, one has never heard of futurism as a particular form of concept. So once we understand the whole of the passage, I'm sure you've now understood and related to what the author is talking about, that futurism is not a particular concept, which is basically a very different kind of a concept. It was some sort of an art movement that was being celebrated at some point of time. But after the death of the person who conceptualized the whole concept of futurism, this particular form of movement, it eventually perished, right? Because why am I using the term perish? Because we've been told at the end, futurism has been regarded as extinct. So it is regarded as perished ever since the death of its leader Marinetti took place, right? Now coming to the questions of the particular passage, we'll quickly glance through the questions and understand what the whole of the passage is talking about. Now coming to question number 1. all of the following is not a criticism of futurism by critics and historians, except that futurism was. Now, here, if you look at the particular questions, what do we understand? In the beginning of the paragraph, we have been told somewhere about this particular aspect of futurism. We've been told about technology. We've been told about the fact as to how the art movement was something that was losing its importance. So, based on that, all of the following is not a criticism of futurism by the critics and historians, except that futurism was anarchistic. It was. People did want a state of anarchy. Anarchy, as I told you, is absolute lawlessness that is there. So, it was something that was anarchist. Not a social movement. It was not a social movement. What kind of movement it was? It was a movement where people were basically asking about the importance of machines. They wanted an insatiable desire for modernity. So it was basically they were trying to celebrate technology, power, and modern life. It was not any sort of a social movement where any sort of a social message was being conveyed. Far right ideology. It was, we've been told somewhere here that the political ideologies were quite similar to the right wing movement. I think we've been told about it somewhere in the second or the third paragraph, right? Not an original idea. So this is not a criticism of it. Why? Because we've been asked except. So if you look at option number D, we have been told somewhere that this form of movement was something that was quite similar or had some sort of an impact of cubism that was there, right? And it was nothing more than the provincial forms. We've been told about it somewhere, that is, I think, at the end of the passage. Yeah, the obvious influence of cubism is another variation of the criticism. So that means it is not an original idea. It was something which had an element of cubism as an influence. So the correct answer for question number 1 is going to be option number D. Which of the following best summarizes the first paragraph? इस टाइप के क्वेश्चंस को अटेम्प्ट करना थोड़ा recommended होता है because this is a paragraph specific question. A says futurism celebrated technology and modern life, highlighting the beauty of machines, speed and violence. Partially correct, but यहाँ पे जो एक aspect of negativity of politics जो है, negative impact जो है हमें यहाँ पे कहीं नहीं बताया, right? So ये तो नहीं हो सकता. क्योंकि यहाँ पे हम लोगों को क्या पता है, aside from the artistic perspective, it also carried with it a strain of politics. उसका यहाँ पे कुछ mention नहीं है, यहाँ पे हम सिर्फ positives के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं. Futurism celebrated modernity, but its entanglement with politics led to embrace the war and fascism. Right? B makes a lot of sense. Yes. C says it is impossible for there to be a direct connection between art. Impossible जो है बहुत far-fetched word है, तो ये तो हो ही नहीं सकता. One of the art forms that was most heavily influenced by politics in 20th century was there for a very long time. This is, of course, not the summary, right? So the correct answer for question number 2 is going to be option number B. Coming to question number 3, each of the following is a valid inference from the passage except. Now, when we are talking about inference, that means we are talking about any sort of a deduction or an extrapolation that we are trying to make based on the facts given by the author. Now, whenever the term inference is used, so that means आपने अपने हिसाब से कोई चीज assume नहीं करना है, आपने logically deduce करना है. I'm using the term logically, right? Now, coming to option number 1. So we're talking about each of the following is a valid inference except. So that means 3 are going to be the inferences. 1 is something that we cannot deduce from the text. The political affiliations of artists can impact how their work is perceived and evaluated. We have been told very clearly about the artists. Somewhere at the end, we have been told about some sort of a movement that was going on. And also we've been told about the fact कि किस तरह से जो हमारे लोकल अब ये जो हमारे आर्टिस्ट थे, राइट? सो जो ये फ्यूचरिज्म वाले स्पेसिफिकली आर्टिस्ट थे, हु वर दीज पीपल? दे वर almost like a model for the fascists, right? So when we talk about Mussolini, we've also been told about the fact as to how futurism did have some sort of a connection with Mussolini's fascism. तो ये तो हमारे को clearly एक valid inference हम निकाल सकते हैं. Fascism is significantly influenced by the genesis of the future movement. Well, the passage majorly talks about the fact that कि futurist manifesto जो है हम लोगों को बताया 1909 में स्टार्ट किया था इसने, this guy Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. This was something that started in 1909, and then we've been told about the fact that it continued till 1944, right? So if we talk about this particular thing, कि futurist manifesto आपका जो publish हुआ था 1909 में, that it served as the movement, or it served as the ideal for the movement of the fascists, right? ये कहीं ना कहीं जो है मसलिनी ने मैरिनेटी की इनोवेशन को अडॉप्ट किया था, लेकिन उसने कहीं पे भी ऐसा नहीं है कि उसको इन्फ्लुएंस किया था. सो इट वाज सम सॉर्ट ऑफ एन adoption, or probably some of the features were being taken from that, right? तो ये probably हम सोच सकते हैं कि it is not a valid inference. Futurism's celebration of modernism was a response to prevailing traditional styles. This is again, we've been told somewhere from the beginning that कि किस तरह से जो आपके existing styles थे, एंड ऑल्सो जो यहाँ पे हम लोगों को ये बताया कि फ्यूचरिज्म एज अ मूवमेंट, इट वाज सेलिब्रेशन का तो बिगिनिंग में बताया है, हम लोगों को ये भी बताया है दैट दिस पर्टिकुलर आइडिया वाज वेरी सिमिलर टू द प्रोपेगेंडा ऑफ द राइट विंग पार्टी. वी ऑल्सो बीन टोल्ड अबाउट द फैक्ट कि किस तरह से बाकी मूवमेंट से जो है प्रोविंशियल जो आपके मूवमेंट्स थे उसमें से भी इसकी काफी एलिमेंट्स को डिराइव किया गया. तो यस, काफी प्रिवेलिंग ट्रेडिशनल स्टाइल्स जो है उसमें से फ्यूचरिज्म आपकी निकली है. Futurism's call for anarchy paradoxically aligned it with Mussolini's fascist. We have been told about this also. At one point of time, these futurism people, they wanted some sort of an anarchy. दो ends का जो हमने discussion किया था passage में, they were at two ends of the same, you can say probably the curve. And one end was majorly talking about anarchy. The other end was basically allying themselves with Mussolini's fascists. So दोनों टाइप के लोग जो हैं यहाँ पे इवेंचुअली थे. उन्होंने इनिशियली बोला कि हमें एनआरकी चाहिए, so that means we never wanted any sort of law, but at the end they aligned themselves with the dictator Mussolini. So eventually from one point of the curve they shifted to the other. So the correct answer for question number 3 is going to be option number B. Now coming to the last question of the passage. The literary genre and narrative form of manifesto has been used by artists, but the members of Futurism used it as a political weapon, thus establishing its precedence among subsequent avant movements. Which one of the following is the best interpretation of the sentence? So जब हम avant garde बोलते हैं, avant movement के बारे में बोलते हैं, तो इसका मतलब क्या होता है? इसका मतलब होता है कि एक बहुत unique kind of a movement, एक बहुत different kind of a movement that has conceptualized something very new. If you look at option number A, Futurism borrowed the ideas of manifesto from artists and established a precedence for avant movements. This is totally out of scope, does not make any sense, because we have been told that even though it has been used before by the artist, but जो members of Futurism हैं, उन्होंने उसको as a political weapon use किया, and finally they established some sort of a precedence over the subsequent, that is the following avant movements. Futurism adopted manifestos as a political tool and introduced them into subsequent avant movements. अब ये भी नहीं हो सकता. क्यों नहीं हो सकता? क्योंकि हम लोगों को ये बोलना है कि पहले उसका प्रेसिडेंस रहा है, राइट? एंड उसके बाद जो है उस प्रेसिडेंस ने क्या किया है, उसको आगे फॉलो किया गया है. सो यहाँ पे हम बोल रहे हैं फ्यूचरिज्म ने अडॉप्ट किया मैनिफेस्टोज एज अ पॉलिटिकल टूल एंड इंट्रोड्यूस देम इनटू सब्सिक्वेंट. इंट्रोड्यूस नहीं कर रहे हैं, हम ये बोल रहे हैं इट वाज लाइक अ बेस फॉर द सब्सिक्वेंट मूवमेंट्स. तो ये भी नहीं हो सकता. Futurism transformed manifestos into political weapons, setting a standard for avant movement. This is going to be the correct answer because it has set some sort of a precedence. Precedence का मतलब क्या होता है कि उससे पहले ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं हुआ था. It was the one that started it. तो उसने हर एक चीज को ट्रांसफॉर्म किया. ट्रांसफॉर्म करने के बाद उसने एक स्टैंडर्ड सेट किया. Futurism used the prior artist manifestos as a political weapon, creating precedence even if they are using something of the prior artist manifestos, right? तो इसका मतलब क्या है? इसका मतलब ये है कि जो मैनिफेस्टो था, it was not something that was their own. उन्होंने सिर्फ किसी का काम कॉपी करके जो है क्रिएट किया था precedence, but we have been told that they transformed it, they changed it. So only if when you change a particular thing are you going to set a precedence for something new. So I hope this particular passage, even though it was something that was high on the key elements of futurism and some sort of things that were related to fascism. The passage is clear to all of you. You should always have a very, as I always say, you should have a very strong base of knowledge of reading passages that are coming from various domains. And when you talk about concepts like these, fascism, Marxism, or you talk about any sort of an ism, that is idealism, pragmatism, these are the concepts that are very often tested in CAT. And the only way to break through these concepts and understand them is a daily practice of the same. So I'll see you in the next session with another engaging or interesting passage. Till then, keep reading. Thank you, and I'll see you.